My name is Emma. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound kind but land quietly. Reliable, easygoing, the sensible one. I'm a project manager by trade, the kind of person people trust to keep things moving without needing applause. In my family, that translated into something else entirely. Someone who would understand, who wouldn't make things complicated, who would stay calm no matter what decisions were made around her. If you'd asked anyone who knew me back then, they might have said I was lucky. Stable career, no scandals, no dramatic fights with relatives. I was the daughter who showed up on time, remembered birthdays, and handled logistics when others didn't want to. I blended in well, too well, as it turns out. This isn't a story about shouting matches or sudden revenge. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no explosive confrontations that go viral in short clips. What happened to me unfolded quietly, through emails that weren't meant for me, conversations that happened behind closed doors, and assumptions that were never checked because no one thought they needed to be. The truth is, my family secretly met with a lawyer to cut me out of the will. I didn't discover it through a confession or a dramatic slip at the dinner table. I found out because a family meeting invitation, one I was never supposed to see, accidentally landed in my inbox. What followed wasn't rage. It wasn't a public meltdown. It was something slower and more unsettling: clarity. Over the next hour or so, I want to walk you through what that clarity did to me, who I was to them before, the small dismissals I learned to swallow, the role I didn't realize I'd accepted, and then the shift, when silence stopped being a reflex and became a choice. I'm telling this story not to punish anyone and not to ask for sympathy. I don't believe in humiliating people for entertainment, and I don't believe in rewriting history to make myself look flawless. I made choices. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I benefited from peace at the cost of visibility, but I also learned something about power, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that grows when you pay attention, document carefully, and move without needing permission. If you've ever felt underestimated by people who claim to love you, if you've ever been treated as fine while decisions were made as if you didn't matter, then you might recognize pieces of yourself in this story. I'm going to tell it honestly, without theatrics, and I'll let you decide what it means. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that people had already decided who you were without asking you? To understand why what happened later hurt the way it did, you have to understand who I was to my family before any lawyers were involved. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't the problem child either. I existed in a quieter category: useful, dependable, emotionally low maintenance. The one who could be counted on without being consulted. The one whose agreement was assumed before it was ever asked for. At family gatherings, my role was predictable. I arrived early, I helped set things up. If someone needed a ride, I coordinated it. If plans changed at the last minute, I adjusted. I was often thanked, but rarely noticed in a way that lingered. Gratitude came quickly and disappeared just as fast. No one said, "Emma doesn't matter." They didn't need to. Their behavior said something softer and more damaging: "Emma will be fine." That phrase followed me for years. When decisions were discussed, real decisions, the kind that shape futures, I was usually informed after the fact. Not excluded outright, just updated. There's a difference, and it's subtle enough that you can doubt yourself for a long time before you name it. If I questioned anything, the response was always calm, almost affectionate. "You're so understanding. You don't get upset about these things. You're not like the others." At first, I took that as a compliment. In my 20s, I wore it like proof of maturity. I told myself that being easy to deal with meant I was emotionally evolved, that I was above drama, that peace was a personal achievement. But peace, I eventually learned, can also be a role you're assigned. I watched as other family members were handled differently. Their feelings were anticipated. Their reactions were managed carefully. When they spoke, people paused. When I spoke, conversations often continued, just slightly louder, as if my words were background noise rather than input. I noticed it, but I minimized it. They're just more expressive. I don't really care about that stuff anyway. It's not worth making things awkward. Those were the stories I told myself. The truth is, I was convenient. My calm made things smoother for everyone else. My silence filled gaps so no one had to. And once a family gets used to that version of you, they start building plans that rely on it. I was the one expected to adapt, to compromise, to accept explanations that arrived after decisions were already locked in place. And because I didn't explode, because I didn't threaten or guilt or cry in public, my reactions were measured against an imaginary scale where silence equaled consent. No one asked if I was okay with that. They didn't need to. I had trained them well. I don't say that with bitterness, just clarity. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being seen as strong but not significant, capable but not central. You become someone others lean on without ever stepping into your inner world. And the most dangerous part? You start doing it to yourself. I began to pre-edit my own needs before speaking. I weighed whether something was worth mentioning. I delayed discomfort so long it eventually felt like it belonged to someone else. From the outside, it probably looked like I had it all together. And in many ways, I did. But internally, there was a quiet erosion happening. A sense that I could disappear from important conversations without anyone noticing my absence. That's who I was to them. Not unloved, not unwanted, just optional. And when you're optional long enough, people start imagining futures where you simply aren't included. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. At the time, I didn't see that habit forming. I just felt tired in a way I couldn't explain. Tired of adjusting. Tired of being fine. Tired of being praised for flexibility when what I actually wanted was consideration. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make speeches. I didn't demand space. I stayed quiet. And they mistook that quiet for permanence. The first time I remember feeling something fracture, it didn't feel dramatic enough to matter. That's important to say, because if it had been loud or cruel, I might have responded differently. I might have defended myself. I might have been forced to acknowledge it as harm. But this wasn't like that. It was quiet, polite, easily explained away. It happened during what was supposed to be a routine family conversation. One of those casual updates that gets framed as just keeping everyone in the loop. We were talking about long-term plans, nothing urgent, nothing final, or at least that's how it was presented to me. Someone mentioned that they'd already spoken to a professional about options, not in detail, just enough to signal that something concrete had already begun. I remember pausing just briefly and asking a simple question. When did that happen? The room didn't freeze. No one looked guilty. Instead, there was a small smile, reassuring, almost indulgent. Oh, it was just exploratory, nothing you needed to worry about. That sentence landed harder than it should have. Not because I wanted control, not because I felt entitled to dictate outcomes, but because it made something very clear, very early. There were levels of involvement, and I was on the outer one. No one else reacted. The conversation moved on. Someone changed the subject. Plates were cleared. The moment passed. Everyone else forgot it. I didn't. I carried it with me in a way that surprised me. Not as anger, but as a low-grade alertness. A sense that I had brushed up against a boundary I didn't know existed. In the days that followed, I replayed it in my head. I tried to be fair. I gave everyone the benefit of the doubt. They probably didn't want to stress me out. It wasn't finalized. They know I don't like conflict. Each explanation sounded reasonable. That's what made it dangerous. Because reasonable explanations are the easiest place to hide exclusion. What lingered wasn't the action itself. It was the assumption underneath it. The idea that I didn't need to be included at the beginning. My role was to understand outcomes, not participate in shaping them. I started paying closer attention after that. Not in a paranoid way, just observant. I noticed how often things were already decided before they were shared. How frequently I was looped in once consensus had been reached elsewhere. Still, I said nothing. Part of me believed that if I made an issue out of something so small, I would look dramatic, oversensitive, ungrateful. I had built my identity around being the calm one, and I didn't know how to step out of that without feeling like I was betraying myself. So I did what I always did. I nodded, I adapted. I told myself it didn't matter. But the body remembers what the mouth dismisses. There was a subtle shift in how I listened after that. Less trust, more pattern recognition. I began to notice who was consulted first, whose reactions were anticipated, whose absence would have delayed a decision, and whose wouldn't. Mine wouldn't have. That realization didn't hurt all at once. It seeped in gradually, like cold through a wall you didn't know was thin. And the hardest part? Everyone was still being nice to me. There was no cruelty to point at, no villain to blame. Just a growing sense that my presence was optional in rooms where futures were quietly shaped. Looking back now, I understand why that moment stayed with me. It wasn't about the topic, it was about precedence. It was the first small cut, not deep enough to bleed, but precise enough to leave a mark. And once you've noticed a cut like that, you start seeing others. Not because they're new, but because you finally stopped looking away. After that first small cut, nothing changed on the surface, and that, in many ways, was the problem. There was no escalation, no apology either. Life continued in the same rhythm, which made it easy to convince myself that what I'd noticed didn't mean anything. When discomfort doesn't get validated, it often gets absorbed instead. I became very good at absorbing. The patterns grew clearer over time, but they did so quietly. Information arrived late. Conversations were summarized instead of shared. Decisions were framed as inevitabilities rather than choices. And each time, the explanation was smooth enough to sound reasonable. You were busy. It was simpler this way. We didn't think you'd want to be involved. None of those statements was cruel. That's what made them effective. I told myself that this was just how families worked. That not everyone needed to be part of every conversation. That my lack of a strong reaction proved I was above the need for control. In reality, I was teaching people what they could do without consequence. What's strange is how quickly the nervous system adapts. At some point, I stopped expecting to be included. I adjusted my emotional posture in advance, lowered the stakes, softened my expectations, rehearsed understanding before anything even happened. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through one big act, but through repetition paired with your own silence. There were moments when I almost spoke up. I remember one in particular, standing in the kitchen after a conversation that had clearly been planned without me. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I didn't want to seem needy. I didn't want to derail the mood. I didn't want to make people defensive, so I swallowed it. Each time I did that, something inside me grew quieter. Not calmer, quieter. There's a difference. Calm is chosen. Quiet is often trained. I watched how others in the family were handled with care. Their preferences were anticipated. Their reactions were managed gently. With me, there was an assumption of resilience so strong it bordered on indifference. And I let it happen because part of me believed that being low maintenance was a virtue. That if I asked for more, I would lose the moral high ground I'd built my identity on. I rationalized everything. They have more at stake. I don't need the validation. It's not personal. But when something isn't personal, it usually doesn't feel personal. This did. I just didn't know how to name it yet. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly minimizing yourself to keep the peace. It's not loud burnout. It's a dull thing. A sense that you're present, but not fully there. I began to notice how my opinions softened before they left my mouth. How I framed thoughts as suggestions rather than statements. How I laughed off things that made me uncomfortable. No one asked me to do that. I did it because it worked. And because it worked, everyone benefited, except me. The irony is that I wasn't trying to be invisible. I just didn't want to be difficult. But over time, those two things became indistinguishable. By the time I realized that something was wrong, it had already been normalized. The imbalance wasn't shocking anymore. It was familiar, comfortable even, in a way that scared me when I finally noticed it. Because once something feels normal, you stop questioning whether it's fair. I didn't see myself as disrespected back then. I saw myself as adaptable, reasonable, mature. It took me a long time to understand that being reasonable in an unreasonable dynamic doesn't make you virtuous. It makes you convenient. And convenience is rarely respected. Still, I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't feel the erosion anymore, but because I didn't know who I would be if I stopped absorbing it. I didn't wake up one morning and realize I'd been given a role. It settled over me gradually, like dust, so light at first you don't notice it accumulating. By the time I saw it clearly, I had already been playing it for years. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the person who could be counted on to handle things without making them heavier. In theory, that sounds like trust. In practice, it meant I was expected to adapt no matter what the situation required. If someone needed help, I was called. If something needed organizing, I handled it. If there was emotional fallout, I absorbed it quietly so others wouldn't have to. But when it came to authority, real authority over outcomes, I wasn't considered essential. My role was execution, not authorship. No one announced this assignment. There was no meeting where it was decided. It emerged from repetition and reward. Every time I smoothed something over, the system worked better for everyone else. Every time I didn't object, the boundaries tightened just a little more. I became the person who would understand. That word followed me everywhere. You'll understand why we did it this way. You're the type who understands. I knew you'd understand. Understanding, in this context, didn't mean empathy going both ways. It meant acceptance without friction. I noticed that when others pushed back, the response was negotiation. When I stayed calm, the response was assumption. People stopped explaining themselves fully. They summarized, they informed, they concluded. And I let them. Part of me believed that this role protected me, that by being the stable one, I was above the messiness of family conflict, that I was spared the stress others carried. But there's a cost to being spared. You're also skipped. I started to see how predictable my reactions had become to them. They knew I wouldn't raise my voice. They knew I wouldn't threaten distance. They knew I valued harmony enough to swallow disappointment. That predictability made me safe, but not in the way people usually mean it. I was safe to overlook. I don't think anyone sat down and thought, Emma doesn't need to be included. I think they thought Emma wouldn't make this hard. And so they built around that assumption. It's unsettling to realize that the qualities you're praised for can become the justification for your exclusion, that your emotional discipline can be interpreted as a lack of need, that your silence can be mistaken for consent. By the time I became aware of the role I was playing, it felt strangely permanent, like stepping out of it would disrupt not just relationships, but an entire system that relied on me being who I'd always been. So I stayed in it. I told myself I was choosing maturity, that I was above petty power struggles, that my worth wasn't tied to being consulted. But deep down, something had shifted. I began to understand that roles once assigned are rarely questioned, especially if they benefit the group. And the longer you play them, the harder it is to convince anyone that you were capable of more all along. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert, because roles can be changed. Not loudly, not all at once, but deliberately. And that was the first time I understood that staying quiet didn't have to mean staying passive. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic turning point anyone else could point to later and say, that's when everything changed. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in the middle of a day that looked exactly like all the others. I was alone, catching up on emails, half listening to the familiar hum of my apartment. One of those days where nothing feels urgent, which is often when clarity finds space to land. That's when the invitation came in. The subject line was neutral, professional, almost boring. Family meeting, confidential. At first, I assumed it had been sent to everyone. I didn't open it right away. I finished what I was doing, closed a few tabs, and took a sip of coffee. When I finally clicked, the details didn't make sense. The language was formal, too formal. There was a date, a time, and the name of a law firm. There were instructions about confidentiality and attendance. And then, at the bottom, a list of recipients. My name wasn't there. I stared at the screen longer than I cared to admit. For a moment, my mind tried to protect me. Maybe this is old. Maybe I'm copied by mistake. Maybe there's another thread I haven't seen yet. Then I noticed something small that removed all doubt. This wasn't sent to me. It was forwarded. Accidentally, someone had typed the wrong address. One extra click. A tiny human error that opened a door I was never meant to see behind. My family had met with a lawyer, not to discuss vague options, not to explore hypotheticals. They were discussing the will, and I wasn't part of it. What surprised me wasn't the shock. It was the absence of it. I didn't feel dizzy. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the urge to call anyone. What I felt instead was a slow, steady settling, like something heavy finally finding its place. Everything I had minimized. Everything I had rationalized. Every moment, I'd told myself I was imagining patterns. It all aligned. The meeting itself wasn't what broke something in me. It was the realization that this had likely been happening for a while. Quietly, deliberately, with enough confidence that no one thought to double-check the guest list. I sat there and let myself read the email again, not emotionally, analytically. I noticed the wording, the structure, the assumptions built into it. This wasn't impulsive. It was organized. And I wasn't forgotten. I was excluded. That distinction mattered. For the first time, I didn't rush to excuse anyone. I didn't search for generous interpretations. I didn't tell myself that it wasn't personal. I just observed. And in that observation, something shifted internally, not toward anger, but toward agency. I realized that my silence up until now had been interpreted exactly as I'd feared. As agreement, as availability, as permission to move forward without me. The invitation didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the role I'd been playing had reached its logical conclusion. I closed the email and sat there for a long time. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't reply. I didn't even save the message to a folder labeled important. I took out my notebook, the one I'd carried for years without knowing why, and wrote down the date, the time, and exactly what I'd seen. Not because I planned revenge, because clarity, once gained, deserves to be respected. That was the day something shifted. Not in how they treated me, but in how I saw myself. After the email, I didn't change my behavior right away. Not externally, at least. I still showed up. I still responded politely. I still played the role everyone expected. But internally, everything was different. Before, my silence had been automatic, a reflex shaped by years of conditioning and self-justification. Now it was deliberate. And there's a profound difference between the two. When you stop speaking because you feel you shouldn't, that's suppression. When you stop speaking because you're watching, that's a strategy. I didn't confront anyone about the meeting, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Speaking too early would only reset the pattern. I would be reassured, pacified, told I was misunderstanding things. And the system would continue, slightly more careful, but unchanged. So I stayed quiet. They mistook that quiet for the same old compliance, and that misunderstanding gave me space. I began to listen differently, not emotionally, but structurally. I paid attention to who spoke first in conversations, whose opinions anchored decisions, and whose presence was symbolic rather than functional. I noticed how often information traveled in side channels. How frequently were they framed as already decided? How rarely anyone checked whether I had input, because they assumed I wouldn't need it. What changed was not my access but my awareness. I also started paying attention to myself. How often I'd overridden my own instincts in the name of being easy. To how much emotional labor I'd performed without ever naming it as such. That awareness didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. I stopped offering help automatically, not dramatically, just subtly. I let pauses exist where I used to fill them. I asked clarifying questions instead of smoothing things over. No one commented on it, but I could feel the system adjusting, trying to figure out where the friction had gone. The truth is, silence has weight when it's chosen. I spent a lot of time thinking about options, not impulsively, methodically. I didn't rush toward confrontation or distance. I didn't fantasize about exposure. I asked myself a harder question. What outcome do I actually want? The answer wasn't punishment. It wasn't validation. It was autonomy. I wanted to stop being managed by assumptions. I wanted my future to be something I participated in shaping. Whether or not others liked it, that meant I needed information, leverage. Not in the sense of control over people, but control over my own position. So I began preparing quietly. I read, I learned, I reviewed documents I'd previously skimmed. I paid attention to timelines, processes, and legal language. Not because I planned to fight, but because I refused to remain ignorant in a system that benefited from my ignorance. And all the while, I said nothing. They saw my silence and assumed it meant nothing had changed, that I was still the same accommodating presence, orbiting without influence. In reality, silence had become my boundary. It protected me from reacting emotionally. It gave me time to think clearly. It allowed me to choose my next steps without interference. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was trying to understand, and that changed everything. What they never noticed was how much I had already learned to operate quietly long before any of this happened. My entire professional life had trained me to pay attention to systems, how decisions are documented, how accountability is distributed, how assumptions become policy, simply by being repeated often enough. I had spent years managing projects where the smallest overlooked detail could derail months of work. At home, those skills had been invisible, or rather, they'd been taken for granted. After the email, I stopped compartmentalizing. I allowed myself to bring the same level of attention I used at work into my personal life, not emotionally, logistically. I began documenting things, not obsessively, just accurately. Dates, conversations, changes in language. I noted when plans shifted and how they were explained. I saved emails that referenced decisions already made. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building a map. And maps reveal patterns you can't see while you're standing inside them. I also educated myself. Quietly, systematically. I learned how estate planning actually works. Not the simplified version people talk about at dinner, but the real mechanisms. I read about trusts, beneficiaries, executors, and the difference between being excluded intentionally versus omitted carelessly. I learned what could be changed easily and what couldn't. That knowledge did something unexpected. It removed the emotional fog. When you understand how systems operate, you stop personalizing every outcome. You see where power actually lives and where it doesn't. I also noticed something else. The confidence with which decisions were being made relied heavily on my predictability, on the assumption that I would not push back, that I would not complicate things. They didn't notice when I stopped volunteering information. They didn't notice when I stopped smoothing over tensions. They didn't notice when I stopped offering solutions before problems were fully formed. Because they weren't looking at me, that invisibility, which had once hurt, became useful. I let them continue underestimating me. In conversations, I listened more than I spoke. When asked direct questions, I answered honestly, but minimally. I didn't argue, I didn't challenge, I didn't reveal what I knew. And no one asked. People often assume that power announces itself, that it looks like dominance, or control, or volume. In reality, power often looks like patience. The more I learned, the calmer I became, not detached, grounded. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was positioning. I also took time to consider my values. What lines I wouldn't cross, what outcomes would I refuse, even if they benefited me materially? I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone or forcing acknowledgments that would only harden resentment. I wanted alignment between my actions and my principles. What they never noticed was that I had stopped waiting to be included. I had started acting as if my consent mattered, whether or not anyone asked for it. They assumed my quiet meant compliance. It didn't. It meant I was done being managed by narratives that no longer fit. By the time they sensed something was different, if they ever did, it was already too late to reset the dynamic, because preparation, once complete, doesn't need permission. And I was almost there. The reveal didn't arrive with drama. There was no sudden document sliding across a table, no whispered confession, no moment where the truth knocked the air out of my lungs. It arrived the way most real power does, quietly through comprehension. By the time I fully understood what was happening, nothing new had technically occurred. All the pieces had been there for a while. I had simply learned how to read them correctly. That in itself was the reveal. I had spent weeks, months really, studying how these systems worked. Not just estate planning in theory, but behavior around it. Who initiates conversations? Who controls information flow? Who benefits from ambiguity? Who assumes silence equals safety? And then one evening, while reviewing notes I'd taken over time, something aligned so cleanly it almost felt clinical. I realized I wasn't just excluded. I was strategically excluded. That distinction mattered more than anything else. This wasn't about oversight or forgetfulness. It wasn't about me being less close, less loved, or less deserving in some vague emotional sense. It was about predictability. I was the variable they didn't need to manage, because I'd never forced them to. Once I saw that clearly, the emotional weight shifted. I wasn't hurt in the way people expect you to be hurt. I wasn't spiraling or grieving some imagined betrayal. What I felt instead was clarity so sharp it was almost calming, because clarity removes confusion. And confusion is where most power imbalances survive. I began tracing the logic backward. If they felt comfortable planning without me, if they felt no urgency to inform me, if they assumed my reaction would be acceptance rather than resistance, then they had already assessed my leverage as non-existent. And that meant two things. First, they believed I wouldn't act. Second, they hadn't prepared for me to act well. That was the moment everything crystallized. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was awake. I reviewed what I knew, objectively, not emotionally. I cross-checked timelines. I compared statements. I looked at how language shifted when things became more formal, how phrases like just preliminary slowly evolved into already handled. It became clear that decisions were being made under the assumption that I would adapt afterward, as I always had. And here's the part that surprised me most. Once I understood the full picture, I didn't feel the urge to confront anyone. Confrontation would have been emotional. Emotion would have signaled uncertainty. Uncertainty would have weakened my position. Instead, I felt something steadier. Resolve. I understood exactly where I stood. And more importantly, where I didn't. That knowledge was the leverage. Not because I could threaten anything, not because I had a secret weapon, but because I could now choose my response with precision. I saw for the first time how much of my past behavior had been shaped by my desire to be seen as good, reasonable, mature. I had confused moral integrity with passivity, assuming the two were linked. They aren't. Integrity is about alignment. Passivity is about avoidance. I stopped confusing the two that night. The private reveal wasn't a document or a sentence or a confession. It was the understanding that I had been underestimated, not because I lacked capacity, but because I had never demonstrated consequence. And consequence doesn't have to be loud to be final. I sat with that realization for a long time. I asked myself hard questions. What do I actually want from this situation? What am I willing to walk away from? What will I not sacrifice to stay comfortable? The answers came slowly but clearly. I didn't want inclusion out of guilt. I didn't want last-minute accommodations. I didn't want apologies prompted by exposure. I wanted sovereignty. I wanted my future to be shaped by my choices, not by how easy I was to manage. And that meant I needed to act in a way that aligned with who I was becoming, not who they thought I was. I also understood something else, something crucial. Once people have mentally written you out of a plan, they rarely reconsider unless forced. And forcing reconsideration often costs more than it's worth. So I stopped aiming for reconsideration. I aimed for finality, not punitive finality, not scorched earth, clean finality. I accepted that the version of me they were planning around was outdated, that they were making decisions based on an old model, one I no longer inhabited. And here's the quietest truth of all. They weren't wrong to assume I'd stay silent. I had until now. But silence, when chosen deliberately, isn't absence. It's positioning. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, but from clarity. The kind that reorganizes you internally. The kind that doesn't ask permission. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. Not impulsively, not emotionally, irreversibly. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I felt inevitable. There's a moment that comes after clarity and before action, where everything feels strangely still. That was where I found myself. Not panicked, not rushed, just standing at a clean internal crossroads, aware that whatever I chose next would quietly define the rest of the story, whether anyone else ever knew it or not. For the first time, I allowed myself to list my options honestly, not the polite options, not the ones that preserved appearances, the real ones. I could confront them. That path was obvious. I imagined it clearly, a calm conversation carefully worded. I'd explain what I'd seen, how it made me feel, how exclusion, even unintentional, creates distance. They'd look surprised, maybe defensive, maybe apologetic. There would be explanations, reassurances, promises to do better. And then what? At best, I'd be retroactively included, brought into a process already shaped without me, consulted but not centered, handed influence only after the structure was set. At worst, I'd be labeled emotional, suspicious, difficult. Either way, the dynamic wouldn't truly change. It would just become more careful. I'd seen that pattern too many times, people adjusting behavior without adjusting belief. So I crossed confrontation off the list, not because it was wrong, but because it wouldn't lead where I needed to go. I could do nothing. This option was tempting in its familiarity. Stay quiet, accept the outcome, tell myself that material things don't define worth. Preserve surface peace. Avoid the discomfort of being misunderstood. There's a certain moral comfort in endurance, in being able to say, I took the high road. But endurance has a hidden cost. It teaches others that your limits are theoretical, that your presence is optional, that your future can be shaped without your participation. I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that if I chose this path, I would carry resentment, not toward them, but toward myself. I crossed that option off too. I could try to negotiate. This one was more subtle. I could position myself as cooperative but concerned. Ask questions, suggest alternatives. Seek partial inclusion without naming exclusion directly. It would look mature, strategic, reasonable, and it would still keep me inside a system that required me to ask permission for relevance. I didn't want relevance granted. I wanted the agency to assume. That option disappeared as soon as I named it. I could walk away entirely. This was the option people romanticize. Emotional distance, reduced contact, quiet withdrawal, build a life elsewhere and let the rest fade. There's power in walking away, but only when it's chosen freely, not reactively. And I wasn't ready to leave from a place of injury. I wanted my departure, if it ever came, to be clean. Not an escape, but a conclusion. That left one option, the irreversible one, the option that didn't involve convincing anyone of anything. The option that didn't require permission, confrontation, or validation. The option that changed my position without asking anyone to acknowledge it. I chose myself. That might sound vague, but it wasn't. Choosing myself meant decoupling my future from assumptions others had built around me. It meant removing my life, financially, legally, structurally, from a narrative I no longer recognized as mine. I didn't want a reaction. I wanted a redefinition. I realized something important at that decision point. The power I needed didn't come from exposing what they were doing. It came from making their plans irrelevant to my stability. If their decisions no longer affected my future, then their inclusion, or lack of it, lost its emotional charge. That's when the choice became irreversible. I didn't tell anyone I decided. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't change my tone or posture. But internally, something clicked into place. I stopped thinking in terms of fairness and started thinking in terms of alignment. What actions would make my life structurally consistent with my values? What moves would ensure that no one could quietly decide my future for me again? The answers weren't dramatic. They were practical. They involved paperwork, planning, restructuring, the kinds of actions that don't look like rebellion but change outcomes permanently. I remember feeling a strange calm as I committed to that path. Not relief, not excitement, calm. Because once you make an irreversible decision internally, uncertainty disappears. There's no more mental bargaining, no more rehearsing conversations that will never happen. Just direction. I also understood that once I moved forward, there would be no going back to the version of me who absorbed discomfort to keep others comfortable. Not because I'd become cold, but because I'd become precise. I wasn't angry at my family. I didn't need them to be villains to justify my choice. People act in their own interest, especially when they believe there will be no consequence. What mattered was that I finally acted in mine. I accepted that my decision might confuse them later, that they might feel blindsided, that they might search for a moment when I changed. They wouldn't find one, because the change wasn't reactive. It was cumulative, and once that realization settled, there was nothing left to debate. I closed my notebook, stood up from the table, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, not revenge, ownership. That was the decision point. And everything after it was execution. Once the decision was made, there was no emotional momentum pushing me forward. No adrenaline, no urgency, just a steady, deliberate sense of follow-through. That's what moving in silence really looks like. It isn't secrecy born from fear. It's privacy born from certainty. I didn't announce changes. I didn't hint at plans. I didn't alter my behavior enough for anyone to comment on it. Outwardly, I remained exactly who they expected me to be: calm, present, unproblematic. Internally, I was reorganizing my life. The first thing I did was separate assumptions from facts. I looked closely at where my future was genuinely entangled with theirs, and where it only felt that way because I'd never challenged the default structure. There were more assumptions than entanglements. I began untangling them one by one. Some steps were administrative, quiet updates that didn't require announcements. Others were strategic, decisions about timing, sequencing, and discretion. I learned very quickly that when you move without emotional noise, systems don't resist you. They only resist disruption. And I wasn't disrupting anything. I was rerouting. I didn't rush. Speed would have attracted attention, and attention would have invited questions. Instead, I worked methodically, allowing time to pass between actions so nothing appeared connected. What surprised me most during this phase was how little anyone noticed. I had always assumed that if I pulled back, even slightly, someone would ask why, that my absence from certain roles would create a vacuum. It didn't. Things adjusted around me. Responsibilities shifted elsewhere. Decisions continued without pause. And in that, there was another quiet confirmation. My presence had been convenient, not essential. That realization didn't sting the way it once would have. By then, it felt clarifying. I also noticed how much emotional energy I'd been spending preemptively managing other people's reactions. Once I stopped doing that, everything became simpler. I wasn't anticipating discomfort anymore. I was preventing it by removing myself from situations that required constant self-erasure. No one objected because no one felt confronted. That's the advantage of moving in silence. You don't trigger defenses. You don't invite negotiation. You don't give people a chance to adapt their behavior just enough to preserve the old dynamic. You change the conditions. I kept records, not obsessively, intentionally. I documented what I needed, nothing more. Facts, not interpretations. Dates, not emotions. Clarity, not narrative. There were moments when I almost said something, when a part of me wanted acknowledgement, recognition, or even a question. But I understood then that recognition wasn't the point. Stability was. I wasn't trying to be seen. I was making sure I could never be sidelined again. As weeks passed, I felt lighter, not because things were resolved, but because I was no longer suspended in uncertainty. My future wasn't dependent on conversations I wasn't invited to. It was mine, and the quietest part of all, they were still planning, still assuming, still operating under the belief that nothing had changed, which meant I was free to finish what I'd started. Consequences rarely announce themselves when they begin. They don't arrive with accusations or raised voices. They don't knock. Most of the time, they slip in quietly, disguised as confusion, as an inconvenience, as a subtle sense that something isn't working the way it used to. That's how it started for them. At first, it was small things, minor disruptions that didn't seem connected. A delay here, a process that suddenly required more effort there. Questions that didn't have immediate answers. Nothing dramatic enough to cause alarm, just enough to create friction. I noticed it before they did. Someone mentioned casually that something had become surprisingly complicated. Another commented that a task had taken longer than expected. There were a few offhand remarks about how things used to be easier when I was more involved. I didn't respond. I listened. What they were experiencing wasn't loss yet. It was an adjustment. The system was trying to compensate for an absence it hadn't acknowledged. And that's always the first phase, when people feel the effect before they understand the cause. I stayed exactly where I was, calm, available, neutral. I didn't step in to fix anything. I didn't offer explanations. I didn't say, this wouldn't have happened if... I let the silence do its work. Because silence, when paired with consistency, forces reflection. Gradually, the tone shifted. The comments became less casual, more puzzled. There was a subtle searching quality to conversations now. An unspoken question hovering in the background. What changed? They didn't ask it directly. That would have required acknowledging that something had changed. Instead, they circled it. Things feel different lately. I can't quite put my finger on it. Everyone seems a bit off. I remained steady. Inside, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. What I felt was confirmation. The consequences weren't emotional, they were structural. Without my quiet labor smoothing transitions, things didn't fall apart. But they didn't glide either. Without my assumed flexibility, plans required more coordination. Without my automatic understanding, explanations had to be more thorough. It wasn't catastrophic. It was inconvenient, and inconvenience is often the first thing people notice when a dynamic shifts. What fascinated me was how quickly the narrative began to adjust. Without anyone naming me directly. There was no "we underestimated Emma." No, "we should have included her." Instead, there was a growing awareness that something once taken for granted was no longer available on demand. That's when the reaching out began. Not confrontational, not apologetic, curious. I received messages framed as check-ins. Invitations disguised as casual catch-ups. Conversations that subtly steered toward topics I deliberately stepped away from. I answered politely, briefly, truthfully. But I didn't reinsert myself. They were feeling the absence of my function, not my presence. And I wasn't interested in resuming a role I'd already outgrown. What they couldn't see, and what I never explained, was that these consequences weren't punishment. They were simply the natural result of a system losing an unacknowledged pillar. I hadn't taken anything away. I had stopped giving it automatically. There's a difference. As weeks passed, the confusion sharpened. Frustration crept in. Not directed at me, but at the situation itself. At the inefficiencies. At the misunderstandings. At each other. That's another thing silence does. It reveals where emotional labor used to absorb tension. Without it, stress doesn't disappear. It redistributes. And suddenly, conversations had edges. Not arguments, just less smoothness, less cushioning. I watched from a distance. Not physically distant, but emotionally untangled. For the first time, I wasn't responsible for maintaining an equilibrium that didn't serve me. I also noticed something else. No one asked me why I'd changed. They asked what I thought. That was new. Not because they wanted my feelings, but because they needed clarity. And that distinction mattered. I offered clarity when it didn't compromise me. Facts, not fixes. Perspective, not labor. I wasn't withholding to be cruel. I was conserving. What struck me most during this phase was how uncomfortable people become when their assumptions stop working. Not angry, unsettled. As if the ground beneath a familiar routine had shifted just enough to throw off balance. And still no one named the real issue, because naming it would require acknowledging that decisions had been made without me. Those plans had been built on my silence. That certainty had rested on an outdated version of who I was. So instead, they felt the loss without understanding it. That's the paradox of quiet dominance. When you move without spectacle, people experience the outcome before they understand the cause. And by the time they do, the structure has already changed. I didn't gloat. I didn't correct them. I didn't step in to reclaim relevance. I simply stayed aligned. And alignment over time is unmistakable. By the end of that phase, something fundamental had shifted. Not in how they treated me, but in how they approached me. There was more caution now, more checking, more awareness. Not respected yet, but recognition. And recognition, once it begins, is irreversible. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, they were already behind it. Not behind me, behind the version of the situation they thought they could still control. The tone changed before the words did. Conversations became more careful. Invitations are more deliberate. There was a new attentiveness that hadn't existed before, as if they were suddenly aware of a variable they'd ignored for too long. But attentiveness, when it arrives late, carries a different energy. It isn't warmth, it's an urgency. I could feel it in the way questions were phrased now. Less declarative, more tentative. In the pauses after I spoke, where people waited to see if I would add more. In the way my responses were no longer glossed over. They were listening. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd been present without impact. Now, without changing my tone or volume, my words seemed to carry weight simply because I no longer filled the gaps automatically. Someone finally asked carefully if everything was okay. I answered honestly, yes, and I meant it. That seemed to confuse them more than anything else. They expected dissatisfaction, hurt, a complaint they could respond to, something concrete they could fix. But there was nothing to fix, because nothing had happened, but because I had already adjusted in ways they couldn't undo. They tried subtle course corrections, including me earlier in conversations, asking for my thoughts before decisions were finalized, framing discussions as collaborative. All things that, years earlier, would have meant a great deal to me. Now they felt misaligned. It wasn't that I rejected the gestures. I simply didn't reorient my life around them. The structure had changed, and structures once set don't bend easily without intention. I could see the discomfort growing as their usual tools stopped working. Reassurance didn't land. Politeness didn't smooth things over. There was no visible conflict to resolve. Just a quiet realization setting in. They had assumed permanence where there was only patience. At some point, someone said, almost to themselves, "We should have talked about this earlier." They were right. But timing matters. Earlier would have been a conversation. Now it was an adjustment. And adjustments don't restore trust. They accommodate reality. I wasn't cold. I wasn't distant. I simply wasn't reactive anymore. My responses came from alignment, not accommodation. That's when the panic began. Not loud, not dramatic. A low-level urgency like trying to stop water from rising after it's already reached the threshold. They searched for the moment they could point to. The misstep. The misunderstanding. They wouldn't find one, because the truth was harder to accept. Nothing broke suddenly. It eroded slowly, quietly, with consent they never realized they were relying on. By the time they understood that my silence had shifted from habit to boundary, it was too late to negotiate. Not because I was unwilling, but because I no longer needed what they were offering. I had built stability elsewhere, internally and structurally. My future no longer hinged on being included in conversations that once defined my sense of belonging. And that's when I saw something unexpected. Regret. Not guilt, not shame. Regret that comes from realizing a resource you assumed would always be available is no longer accessible on the same terms. It wasn't personal, but it was real. I didn't explain myself. I didn't recount the email or the meeting or the patterns I'd observed. Doing so would have reopened a negotiation I'd already closed. I simply stayed consistent. And consistency is the hardest thing to argue with. They couldn't fix it, not because I refused to engage, but because the version of me they were trying to repair no longer existed. What they were responding to now was someone who had already moved on internally, and that quietly was final. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like one. There was no dramatic request to sit down and talk, no raised voices, no rehearsed speeches. It happened in a quiet moment, almost incidental, when enough unspoken tension had accumulated that pretending it wasn't there became harder than naming it. Someone asked me, calmly, carefully, whether I felt excluded. The question was framed gently, as if trying not to disturb something fragile. I took a moment before answering, not to compose myself, but to check in with what I actually felt. I said, for a long time. No accusation, no list of grievances, just a statement of fact. The silence that followed wasn't defensive. It was unsettled. They had expected more emotion, more explanation, something they could respond to. Instead, I stayed still. I didn't bring up the email. I didn't reference the meeting. I didn't describe the patterns I'd tracked over the years. Not because I was protecting them, but because I didn't need to justify myself anymore. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was being clear. Someone started to explain, not defensively, earnestly, about intentions, about how things had just evolved, about how no one meant for me to feel sidelined. I listened, truly listened, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to soften what I heard. I didn't rush to reassure them that it was okay. I didn't interrupt to say I understood. When they finished, I nodded. I believe you, I said, and I also believe the outcome. That was the moment the room shifted, because outcomes are harder to argue with than intentions. I wasn't angry. I wasn't distant. I wasn't even disappointed in the way they expected. What I felt was grounded, present, unmovable. They asked what I wanted now. That question mattered. Years earlier, I would have answered with something relational. Inclusion, communication, a seat at the table. Now my answer was simpler. I want to keep living the way I am now, I said. It works for me. There was confusion in that. Maybe even fear. Because they couldn't hear a demand, and they couldn't hear forgiveness either. What they heard was autonomy. I didn't ask for apologies. I didn't ask for changes. I didn't threaten distance. I didn't outline consequences. I let the reality speak for itself. This wasn't a confrontation meant to reset the past. It was a moment of alignment in the present. I wasn't there to punish anyone. I wasn't there to rewrite history. I was there to be honest, without heat, without performance. And honesty delivered calmly is disarming. The conversation ended quietly. No resolution was announced. No emotional closure was declared. But something had been acknowledged. Not my pain, my position. And that was enough. Who I am now doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no reinvention montage, no sharp break from the past. I didn't cut people off or rewrite my personality. I still speak softly, I still listen carefully, I still value calm. But the center of gravity has shifted. Before, my sense of self was relational. I measured stability by how little disruption I caused. I felt secure when others were comfortable, even if that comfort depended on my silence. Now my sense of self is internal. I no longer evaluate my worth by how easy I am to manage. I don't preemptively shrink to fit spaces that weren't built with me in mind. I don't mistake emotional restraint for obligation. That change didn't make me colder. It made it clearer. I've learned that you can be kind without being pliable, that you can be understanding without being absent, that you can love people and still refuse to organize your life around their assumptions. I still show up, but differently. I participate when alignment exists. I step back when it doesn't. I don't explain every boundary. I don't narrate my internal process. I let my consistency do the talking. And people have adjusted, some more easily than others. There's a subtle respect now that wasn't there before. Not admiration, not deference. Respect is born from uncertainty, because I'm no longer predictable in the way I used to be. They don't assume anymore. They ask. That alone tells me everything has changed. I don't resent my past self. She did what she thought was right with the tools she had. She believed that being good meant being agreeable, that maturity meant self-containment. She wasn't wrong. She was just incomplete. What I know now is that peace built on self-erasure isn't peace. It's a postponement, and postponement always comes due. I also understand that quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about orientation, about where your decisions originate. Mine no longer originate from fear of being misunderstood. They come from alignment. I don't need acknowledgement to feel real. I don't need inclusion to feel secure. I don't need to be central to be grounded. And because of that, I'm no longer optional in my own life. The irony is that nothing external had to change for that to be true. The shift happened the moment I stopped negotiating with myself. That's who I am now. Not louder, not harder, just anchored. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to offer a verdict, to name winners and losers, to frame the ending as justice served. That's not what this was. What happened to me didn't resolve because someone apologized the right way, or because a plan was reversed, or because I finally said the perfect thing. It resolved because I stopped outsourcing my stability to rooms where I wasn't invited to speak. The quiet truth is this: most harm isn't caused by cruelty. It's caused by convenience. People don't always decide to exclude you. They decide you'll adapt. And if you do consistently and without consequence, that assumption hardens into structure. I learned that being fine is not the same as being considered, that understanding without reciprocity becomes erasure, and that silence, when it's unchosen, teaches others how far they can go. But I also learned something hopeful. Power doesn't require spectacle. It doesn't need to announce itself or seek validation. It grows when you align your actions with your values and stop waiting for permission to matter. Quiet dominance isn't about controlling outcomes for others. It's about controlling your orientation, where you stand, what you tolerate, and what you no longer negotiate with yourself about. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't rewrite the past. I simply stepped out of a role that depended on my self-erasure and built a life that didn't require it. That's not revenge. That's responsibility. If there's a moral here, it's not cut people off or never trust anyone. It's this. If people consistently make decisions as if you'll be fine, ask yourself who taught them that lesson, and then decide whether you want to keep teaching it. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your flexibility. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that costs you your voice. You can be calm and still be firm. You can be kind and still be non-negotiable. You can love people and still refuse to be optional. Sometimes the most decisive act isn't confrontation, it's realignment. Not louder, not harsher, just truer. That's where the story ends. Not with distance or drama, but with clarity. And the kind of peace that comes from knowing your life no longer depends on being overlooked. If this resonated with you, I want to leave you with one question. Have you ever realized that people weren't mistreating you? They were simply responding to the version of you that learned to stay quiet?